have Emily. Delighted to have Emily Talen with us here today. Many of you know Emily. She's a professor here and also the faculty director of the Kreisman Initiative for Housing on Policy. Emily got her PhD in urban geography from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And her research is devoted to urban design and urbanism, especially the relationship between the built environment and social equity. And her books include, I think that we might have them on our shelf over here, New Urbanism and American Planning, Design for Diversity, Urban Design Reclaimed, and City Rules. She's also edited a number of edited volumes, I won't list. She's a recipient of a Guggenheim Award. She's a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. And her next book is going to be called Neighborhood.
That's already been published.
Oh,
Boy, that's
well,
out of date.
her last book was called Neighborhood. Her next book is going to be called Density Where It Should Be.
So thank you so thank you so much, Chris. Thanks everybody for turning out. I have no illusions. You're here for the free food. I know, but thanks for coming and listening to me about density. I have my chair here in case you have a bum knee. It's happening. My knee will just give out. Kind of an old people thing, I guess. So I've been doing a lot of work lately on density, measuring it, thinking about the context of density, about it in Chicago in particular. Density is one of these things that's so vital and essential, but at the same time can be very dry and mundane. But then it's the stuff of epic neighborhood battles around Chicago, around lots of different neighborhoods in the US. And I think we have a kind of love-hate relationship with density, loving the services and vibrancy that it engenders, but not loving the externalities, possibly congestion, possibly higher housing prices, possibly lack of open space. The list goes on. Whatever the downsides, we know that cities need to be compact and therefore they need to be dense. Why? Well, we can list all kinds of reasons: to maximize access, to promote productivity and innovation, to sustain civic life, to limit environmental harm, keep the humans from sprawling out and out and out. I don't care what the New York Times says, and foster social connection. All of these things require density. But here's the key point. That does not mean density everywhere. And my basic point in my remarks today is going to be that I don't think we've been very smart about where we put density. And it's just, we're not really thinking about the spatial logic of where density should be. We need density in ways that minimize social and environmental cost, but still reap the many benefits. And this is really one way one could define what city planning is, in fact. So Lydia Wilden and I tried to sort all the complexity about density out last year when she was here as a postdoc, and we published this paper, The Density Puzzle. And you would be amazed at how much research and writing there has been about density, and it gets really complicated. There's a lot of mixed outcomes. There's a lot of unintended consequences about density. There's a lot of debates about density. And I think a lot of the complexity and frankly confusion boils down to density being located where it shouldn't be. When we get these outcomes where density is not doing what we hope it's going to do, all these good things I mentioned at the beginning, often it boils down to density not being in the right place. And chief among these problems is the case where density is located without access to amenities, especially public transit. Density without transit results in more rather than less environmental harm, in large part because it increases car dependence, which runs counter to one of the main reasons for promoting density in the first place. And so my main argument here is a simple one. As I said, whether density is good or bad, whether it has the outcomes we want or not, it depends. And this dependence is really about the context of density. So I want to preface my further remarks about density with a bit about this runaway bestseller. Not. This is my latest book, actually, that came out last year. And this book is about how to interpret patterns and forms. Because cities don't just build themselves, they're willed into existence. The positions of things, the configuration of spaces, density patterns. A lot of this might seem accidental, but someone at some point made a decision about what to put where. Even if something happens out of inertia more than anything else, or it seems like it didn't have much forethought, or if it just seems like the invisible hand of the market at play, or it was just a product of zoning in some way. In truth, it's a product of all of these things. There still is the mark of human intention behind every city pattern and form. There is a motive, and that's what this book is about. So when you think about all the ways that patterns and forms can impact our lives, what are all the things that are impacted? Choice, access, opportunity, interaction, movement, mobility, identity, connection, mix, security. The list goes on. Patterns and forms are used to express power, to establish alliances, to assert independence. Spaces can be thought of as embodied, gendered, inscribed, contested. And these are all the kinds of different dimensions that I tried to consolidate in one place in this book. And obviously a lot of people have written on this topic of how to interpret urban pattern and form over the years. And I draw from all of that and I just kind of consolidate it. So that's really the main contribution. So I'll give an example of what I mean by reading urban pattern and form. There are obvious interpretations here when looking at these different levels of density, about the price and availability of land, about tolerance for living close to fellow humans, the willingness to trade off public space for private space, and also financial structures, especially the degree to which housing finance and capital markets are integrated, because that has an impact on the kind of housing produced. In Europe's major cities, Berlin here, large government-backed financial institutions favored large-scale apartment blocks. In the Anglo-American world, at least initially, or in the US and Levittown, the financial system was decentralized and involved small depositors taking out loans, which translated to single-family houses. So that's what you can read into, one aspect of what you can read into these particular kinds of density. Other examples, Versailles, we can read the desires of authoritarian figures who wanted to manifest power in the form of extreme monumentality and centrality, all roads pointing to the king. The money-making objectives of landowners tend to prioritize in Middleborough, prioritize regularized, gridded land division. The desire to instill a sense of communal life might result in housing clustered around public space. Very different objectives at work. Sometimes forms and patterns are pretty literal. This example from Belgium, Schorpenheuvel, probably not pronouncing that right. It's a 17th century town in Belgium. It had 7 sides, and that was because the number 7 is highly symbolic in Christianity, a religiously meaningful number corresponding to the number of the Virgin Mary's 7 sorrows and 7 joys. And because of that holy plan, the town was, and actually it still is, a pilgrimage destination. Dubai, something completely different, has been described as an immense psychotic assemblage of fantasy kitsch that expresses an affection for money and playtime, maybe not too unlike Las Vegas. And then Beijing's Olympic Village has been read as the physical manifestation of a vast exploitable workforce and a state that's capable of exploiting that workforce whenever it needs to build things. We have our own examples of that with urban renewal. City patterns and forms reveal a society's attitude toward life. If there is great precision and uniformity, like these houses up here, every house set back at the exact same distance. There is a financial calculus, of course, at work here. There's production building, but it also signals an adherence to rules and quite possibly a love of predictability, uniformity, and conformance. City patterns might say something about religious beliefs too. Venice, with its multitude of churches, can be compared to Amsterdam with comparatively few. Italians with their love of religious physical expression, in contrast with a Dutch city where, although religious attitudes were actually often stronger than in Venice, the moral order of Calvinism took the place of churches. Heidelberg, here we have a castle towering above a town expressing power, focused on subordination of the town. Contrast that with Urbino, Italy, a castle nestled in the urban fabric, expressing confidence, one could say, and an openness to collective life as the basis of power. Pretty generous reading of Italian city. The medieval city, a lot to read in here, a sense of limits to the medieval city. Back in the day, the city needed to be contained within walls because building new walls was a major expensive undertaking. And so cities got denser and denser to accommodate a growing population. And it was only when it really became unbearable in that medieval city did walls get taken down and extended further out. And so that resulting density and compactness just exuded security, not just the surrounding walls, but also the narrow streets and the sense of enclosure that one feels in the medieval city. And there's a very key social distinction here. The medieval town had tight spaces and a labyrinthine street system that was not conducive to big social gatherings and anonymity and popular uprisings. It was conducive to a more intimate form of social exchange. We can contrast that with the big American city, Chicago, where there seems to be an attitude that there are no limits and more is better, bigger is better, quantity as an indicator of success rather than quality. Of course, there's a lot more we could say about that. And then you have single purpose patterns and forms where one idea is really driving the whole thing. And this is Aluminum City Terrace near Pittsburgh. Buildings were arranged solely for solar orientation with no other intent shown, such as arranging buildings for social life or pedestrian circulation or something like that. My last example from the book, the rebuilding of Bucharest along socialist lines in the 1970s, had the goal of eliminating single-family housing, not only because that represented bourgeois fabric, but because people in single-family structures, especially where dispersed on winding roads, were less controllable. And so diversity of building types and forms was to be eliminated because it reminded people of, not only could people not be controlled, but it reminded people of former social and cultural values, which the new regime was trying to eliminate. And so what did they do? They put modern high-rises around the historic single-family housing, creating a pretty awkward pattern. So getting back to density, that was all my preface, and to push my book. There's a lot we can read into patterns of density in the city. And this context, this pattern is, a lot of it has to do with context of density. And when I talk about context, it's two senses of the term. A larger kind of citywide, where is it? kind of context and a site level context. And both of these are really important to think about with density. Now, as I said, there's just been a ton of research on density and even a lot of research on simply measuring it. And it can get very complex. And this is a graphic out of a recent paper, the Urban Density Assemblage, modeling multiple measures. These are Kim Dovey, Alec Pafka, really great urban design team. These are friends of mine. I don't mean to critique what they're doing here, but I do think that it's getting a little too complex for usefulness at times, measuring density. And, you know, urban designers and the urban design literature can get really in the weeds on this kind of thing. I personally think that density based on total acreage of a neighborhood, population per, is not a bad measure at all. And I prefer gross density. It's a very different kind of calculation from net density. Net density removes streets, parks, commercial areas. So the denominator is only residential lots. And so, for example, Hong Kong, 6,300 per square kilometer, net density, gross density. But net density is a completely different thing. So on that net density, pulling out all the green areas, green spaces. So there's also something called weighted density, which I think is pretty useful. And that involves weighting the density of each subunit, like a census tract in a city, by its percentage of the city's total population. And that's interesting because that means that very sparsely populated tracts are discounted and densely populated tracts are given more weight. So a lot of people in the urban design world like weighted density. I'm going to use gross density. I think I like it because it's easier to calculate because when you have to start doing net density and pulling out all the areas of green and parking lots and commercial, it gets a lot more complicated. And I like it because it takes into account the context of density. So let's look at some comparisons and some examples of reading density, the low density suburb. Here we have segregated uses. And what does that mean? That means car dependence. We have a rejection of the street with its aligned frontages and spatial definition. The street is therefore downgraded as public space. It's really just all about being available for cars. And there's a lot of ironies in the low density sprawling suburb. A life closer to nature that is actually damaging to nature, green lawns and deep setbacks and low building height, curvilinearity intended to imitate a kind of organic feel that is actually pretty wasteful. Power and wealth in the hands of the banking, construction, and real estate sectors. There's a veneer of adaptability and freedom, but the geographic spread of sprawl is often opposite. And it's a pattern and form really built for homogeneity. The tower in the park, here you're looking at higher density, 50 people per acre. But what are we reading into this kind of density? Containment, insularity. Buildings are treated as isolated objects in space rather than being part of a larger interconnected urban fabric. Buildings are set in green space in a quest to make them more natural. Streets might be replaced with parks even. And although doing that usually results in more separation and more cars and the need for parking lots. There's often an aspiration that green space will foster social connection, but green space is a passive social space often. And so it's not a space in which social interaction naturally springs from people engaged in daily tasks like an interconnected street network would be. There's no availability of eyes on the street, natural surveillance. And there's a lot of what we call lost space here. How are you going to activate a lot of these spaces? The paths through here are not lined with activities. This is actually, for a lot of people in my world, which is urban design, smart growth, people who are out there pushing walkability, pedestrian cities, getting away from cars, et cetera. This is our sweet spot. And this is the missing middle neighborhood, you might call it. And this is Rogers Park, for example. A mix of housing types, including duplexes and small apartment buildings. You get 100 people per acre for this. There are still some single family houses here. The mix supports social diversity as well as amenities. There's much higher and much lower. There is a greater amount of social diversity. That's all been measured and documented, although we're constantly in the process of losing that. The most socially diverse neighborhoods are those where no one housing type represents more than 60% of the housing stock. For Chicago, that's what I have found in my measures. Neighborhoods like this are almost always gridded, which means that housing on the grid is part of a network connecting it to the rest of the city. Transit-based, there are shared walls, there's alignment, there's aligned building frontage, which creating that sense of enclosure, an outdoor room. Public space, streets and sidewalks are relied on for settings of social life rather than parks and rather than individual yards. So it's a very different kind of approach to social space. Lots are relatively small, and that makes a huge difference for density. And I want to show you one example. Here's the same amount of land area in San Francisco versus Arizona, a suburb of Arizona, Cave Creek. These are all single family houses, but in San Francisco, the lots are 25-foot wide, like we have in Chicago, and you get 480 housing units in 1/4 mile square. In Cave Creek, you get the 75-foot wide lots, you get 75 housing units. So you see how multiplied across the US, it's making a humongous difference in density levels. As I said, the value of density really depends on context, both in terms of where it is in the city and on the site level. So in other words, not all density is created equal in terms of spatial pattern. So this is what I've been doing looking at Chicago. I have been looking at evaluating the context of density relative to what I call urban assets. And I picked 3 that I think are pretty major and pretty standard. Station areas, pedestrian-oriented retail streets, so not just any commercial area, but a street that's really got that pedestrian-oriented retail. And then parks, and not all parks, but the neighborhood and community scale parks. I didn't include, for example, pocket parks because they might not be really set up to get density around them. And regional scale parks have, they're really large and have a regional draw. So you might need to have more parking around the park or something like that. But what I wanted to do is look at, okay, so here's our assets. And let's say in our great city planning world where our key objective is to put people and assets in close proximity, wouldn't we expect density to be located in these areas? And so I measured at different distances. I also had a reasoning about the distance that one would expect around a particular asset, people to have walkable access to these things. So for transit stations, I used a very common measure of a half a mile around the station. That's the distance somebody can walk in 10 minutes at 3 miles per hour. And for pedestrian retail streets, I used a 1/4 mile distance around the street. The distance one might walk in 5 minutes, a conservative distance conventionally associated with walkable access to stores. And then for parks, I used something much closer. I used a 1/8 mile distance based on the reasoning that the benefit of living close to a park falls away quickly if one is not relatively close to it. So, you know, these metrics, we could argue about adjusting these distances, which actually I did that in getting this paper published. You know, one of the comments was, well, what about this distance? And I did that analysis with different distances, and it didn't really make much difference. So here's kind of the key point. I looked at all of this, all of these distances, and the density around all these assets back 100 years. And what you are looking at here is that, so for the city of Chicago, we all know that the city city of Chicago population declined. Interestingly, we are about at the level right now where we were 100 years ago in 1920. So population really peaked in 1950 at 3.6 million, and now we're at 2.7 as we were in 1920 and as we are now. But what's interesting is that density around these assets peaked in 1960 and 1970 and then declined significantly after 1970, between 1970 and 1980. And the overall trend for the city was flatter. So in other words, there's loss of population, but it wasn't around, but there was more loss of population around the assets than around the city as a whole. And, you know, population has never regained since the high point in 1960. There was some uptick in the most recent decade, so that's good news. Since 1980, and here's the summary, the pattern for all three assets has been the same, with a flattening out of population for the last 40 years. So if you look at areas that have high density above the median, that don't have access to these three amenities, the situation has gotten a lot worse. 100 years ago, those areas with high density, low access to stations, parks, and pedestrian retail streets was pretty contained in particular areas, a lot of industrial areas. But now it's spread all over the place. All of those areas have high density and low access to assets. And in 1920, the percent of population that had this condition of having high density and low assets was around 21%. It was really at its best point in 1970, right before a major dip. And now it's about double what it was, the percent of population that's living in high density without access to these assets. And what's kind of interesting is that this is affecting all areas of Chicago, rich and poor, white and non-white. All of these areas have seen declines of population around these primary assets. Even the wealthier areas of Chicago, the North Side regions, have less than half the population density around their stations, their streets, and their parks than they had in 1960. I would say, though, that the South Side of Chicago declined the most dramatically. So everybody's declined, but the South Side had the biggest. So the current situation is that 1/3 of the population in Chicago is living in an area, relatively high density, with no close proximity to stations, walkable retail, or parks, community and neighborhood parks. So this is a problem in terms of, you know, if you put on your city planner lens, this is a problem in terms of people lacking access, but in turn, the lack of density undermines our assets. So it's not only assets supporting density, but density supporting assets. So parks that are trying to be safe and trying to have plenty of people populating them, instead are surrounded by parking lots and, institutional buildings that don't have population living there. We have remnants of retail streets trying to hang on, not having the population there. We have transit stations that are trying to be more than park and rides, but sometimes that's what they become. And then, of course, we stick density where it has no business being, with no access to public assets, no transit, no walkable retail, no parks. And that's where we're sticking a lot of density. What's to blame for this, or what can we explain about this? So I gave examples about interpreting this as being, it's not a very good positive interpretation, but what are some of the things we could look to? Well, of course, the first thing you're going to think of is zoning, or one of the first things. And zoning is a problem. Zoning is a problem. 50% of station areas have more than 20% zoned for single family detached housing. So there's way too many station areas that are only for single family housing. That's a problem. And for this part of the analysis, by the way, I just looked at station areas rather than retail and parks. 12% of station areas have more than 20% zoning for mid to high density. So that's 12%, but it's only 12%. And 25% of station areas have more than 20% missing middle. What about transit-oriented development? Well, there have been successes with transit-oriented development in Chicago, but it's really been a matter of population growth around the most capital-intensive parts of the city, the Loop. Chicago's TOD ordinances, which started in 2013, provide density incentives that have had this success. By 2022, more than 10,000 housing units had been constructed as TOD projects. But the population growth is concentrated in the downtown and its adjacent neighborhoods. And between 2000 and 2014, great, the downtown increased in population by almost 400%. It's been 9% since 2014. But in transit areas outside of downtown, there was a 3% decline in population between 2000 and 2020. And 62% of station areas saw a decrease in population between those in those 2 decades. And it seems that away from the downtown, land is, rather than being filled in with housing density, we're getting a lot of pop-up art spaces, we're getting community gardens, we're getting playgrounds, we're not getting housing. And so that's something to think about. Okay, so another thing I looked at as an explanation in all of this, besides zoning, is the scale of buildings. And what I found, sorry about this big table of numbers, that's kind of obnoxious, but looking at earlier work I've done is looking at every block in Chicago and thinking about it in terms of what scale is this. So scale 1 is single family housing. Scale 2 is 2 to 4 units, kind of that missing middle thing. Scale 3 is a little bit bigger, but still smaller buildings. And then 4 and 5 are high rises and larger buildings, which, by the way, are only 1% of Chicago buildings. To scale 4 is 1%, and scale 5 is 1%. But anyway, it's the scale 4 and 5 that is driving the population growth. And that's not surprising given what I just showed you about the population growth being concentrated in those TOD areas, mostly in the Loop. Lower scaled buildings, 2 and 3 level, the missing middle, in fact, dominate most station areas. But despite this predominance, lower scaled buildings show no statistically significant relationship to recent population growth. And just a kind of little side note, historical side note, is we have seen huge changes in building scale over the past 100 years. And what's interesting to me, so you're looking at two different areas where students went in and, or research assistants went in and digitized Sanborn maps and looked at the number of housing units in these areas and then compared it with what's going on now. And so what you can see is, you know, a dramatically different kind of scale in terms of building development. So here's the key point. We don't necessarily need large buildings to increase population in these station areas, because what this Sanborn process showed is that there was way more population in these areas, in these smaller buildings. Now, this was in part because, you know, household size was bigger. There was more tolerance for living in certain kinds of urban environments, but still, I do think big buildings, big mega developments in station areas relying solely on that is creating some problems for us. It's the big buildings that are most fought against. They tend to be car magnets, even though in station areas, you don't have to have parking. Parking requirement is relaxed, but still developers put it in. They're not prohibited from putting it in. Often such large developments are unaffordable unless they have that affordable housing component, which, you know, it takes Herculean effort to build these big mega projects. They involve investors making money on Wall Street. It's a whole big process. And they take many years to pull off. There's also, I think, a kind of loss of texture, of pedestrian quality, of wealth building that's more distributed around small developers and investors when you get that smaller kind of footprint. Apologies again for more tables, but this is just, I also looked at ownership as a possible explanation and land use as an explanation. The ownership one, I was really surprised at. On-site ownership, that's kind of correlates with single family housing. And so that was, you know, kind of explaining a loss of population, but that's to be expected. I thought that I would find that institutions are really a problem here, because you get hospitals, you get universities near these transit areas. I know in my own neighborhood, which is DePaul has just been gobbling up housing all over the place, tearing it down. So that is one explanation for loss of population. But I didn't find it statistically in my analysis. I might have to go in and rethink about how to do this to get the right conclusion. Yeah, and in terms of land use, commercial land use was the only statistically significant land use variable explaining population growth. And I think, again, this is about the loop. You know, if commercial land use is in the form of mixed use development, which it often is, that combines residential and commercial, and that might explain the association. But, you know, it's interesting how little, relatively small commercial land use actually is, way more in tax exempt, for example. So that's why I was surprised at that conclusion. So I haven't said much at all about the site level context of density, but it is something that interests me greatly. So I'm going to close with a few thoughts about that, because basically there is a lot that can be improved there. I feel like density is often a problem for people because of how it's designed. And it's the devil is in the details. You know, people are confronted with ugly box buildings. And if they have, you know, cars associated with them, then there's thoughts about congestion and things. And it's just making density really unlovable, and people are fighting against it, even though density can reap rewards. And there's a lot of really cool stuff. Oh, is this playing? Oh, cool. that people are doing in the urban design world, and it's kind of the science of beauty in the built environment. Questions about, are buildings vertically oriented are there openings vertically aligned? Is there a relationship between the various building details? Principles about facade volumes, about focus areas, principles about the streetscape, and density fits into all of this research. And this is more the architecture, neuroscience kind of folks. And I don't personally do this. I stole this from this guy, Adam Banoski, but I think it's cool. And I think it has something, I think understanding these kind of design principles is going to have something to do with acceptance of density at the site level scale. And I think density is often kind of frightening. Now, this is a book that I just finished with Sung-Duk Lee, who's actually a graphic designer. And we were really interested in this question of this kind of site level density. How do we make density something beloved rather than, feared, and justifiably feared often? And so one of the things that we did is we did a survey, a visual preference survey using a Qualtrics panel. And we didn't just show people different levels of density because we felt like people would say, oh, I want that single family home. Of course, I want that big mansion. But in this kind of a visual preference survey, you don't get to talk to them about trade-offs and things like that. So what we wanted to know is, let's show all the different types of that kind of missing middle housing that can get you a lot of density, but it's not single family housing. What are the different variables there? So there are variables like, does it have green attached to it? Is transit sort of integrated in ways that make it kind of lovable and pedestrian oriented? Missing middle that's not a very good term, but this was more about housing that had a kind of look of a single family kind of design. Frontage that's really transparent, has a lot of windows and of inviting front stoop. A kind of courtyard setting where you have, communal space is very much a part of it. Historic structures, retail that's integrated. And so we did this survey and we really wanted to understand the qualities of density that might make it more acceptable and even preferred. And what we found in the end was the top tier, the big winners, were density that had green, kind of missing middle components, and a very friendly, open kind of communal space frontage. The losers, the bottom tier, was kind of just as expected, although there was some transit visible here. And some green, it wasn't enough to kind of sway our panel, our survey respondents, and these buildings might have been killing it. These like ugly density buildings. So a lot more could be said about that, but that's just some survey work to try to get at this. So I think this is my last slide. Yeah. So I started by saying that it's important to develop an interpretive skill about the city. Understand the implications of patterns and forms, how to read them. What do they say? What do they say to us? And then I showed that the proximity between these urban assets and population density in Chicago is pretty weak and has been in decline for decades, and such that now a third of Chicago's population is living high density with not close access to these particular assets. And I think this disconnection, what does that show? What is that disconnection of density and assets really showing? And I think we could say that this is good for class discussion, but we could say things like, it shows a certain ambivalence about our urban assets. It shows an ambivalence about the importance of spatial planning. It shows a failure to maximize public investment and really think about, hey, we made these public investments in streetscapes, supporting retail, in parks and in transit, and we need to maximize the people that are living near it. It shows underutilized potential for community building within these, taking advantage of these assets. And I guess perhaps it just shows the weak state of city planning in the US. Now, I have been tracking down different stories that I hear about loss of density near transit areas. And in my own neighborhood, which, as I mentioned, is DePaul, it's the Fullerton Red Line stop. And DePaul is sitting on vacant buildings right near the train station. And there's some residential, but there's vacant space too. And I had a long talk with the DePaul campus planner. And he told me this whole convoluted story about how, well, we're waiting for the president, there's a new president, there's a new person involved. We're worried about what the neighborhood would think, yada, 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 on and on. And it was just, nobody was telling them, this is a public asset, you need to put some housing near there. And they're tearing down housing all over the place. Anyway, don't get me started on DePaul, I'm not happy with them. So U of C is not the only bad university in terms of land development things. So this is, I guess you could say this is kind of an old story here. You know, loss of population in big cities like Chicago, we know that that happened. A shift to preference for suburban living, racial tensions driving that, the loss of urban industrial economy, cheap gas and automobiles, highway building, subsidies like mortgage deductions, all of those shifts have been happening and, you know, population moving out. But those broad shifts don't explain why within the city, there would be loss of density close to these assets. And so that's what concerns me. What can we do to turn this around? Well, you know, the thing is, we already know what to do. Work with neighborhoods to build support for plans aimed at higher density around these strategic locations, push the benefits of increased density near these assets, pay attention to the design, make density lovable. Chicago is just adamantly against form-based coding, which I think is a mistake. I met the zoning administrator the other day for the city. I said, why don't you guys do form-based coding, which would pay attention to those design things I was talking about at the site level? He said, oh, well, we just don't think it's a good idea. Other big cities are doing it, by the way. Miami, Buffalo, Denver, all of these places have gotten on board with the importance of paying attention to the design of buildings. And the zoning administrator, super nice guy, but he said, would it really matter? Because the alderman can just override anything anyway. And I thought that was kind of very depressing. So there's a lot of different things one needs to figure out to make all this work. But in the end, I hope we can make an argument that proximity to assets is fundamental to building cities sustainably. And we need more people to live close to what the city has to offer. We need to figure that out. So that's the end of my show. Thank you. I welcome your question. Yes.
So I have a question that was really emphasized by your concluding remarks about essentially about biases. So
What?
About biases.
Biases.
Like, for example, biases towards or against like transit access and density. And so in your concluding remark, you said that, you know, the preference for sparsity was more of a suburban thing, but in the city it's very different. But what do you make of this like cross-pollination of ideas where the desire for suburban living has kind of entered the city? So people might want to keep their cars, even if it makes more like financial sense to invest in transit in the long run. for example, you have a lot of these neighborhoods in the southwest side that are super dense, but they might not want transit to be brought out to their neighborhoods. How do these conflicting biases influence your analysis?
Yeah, well, it concerns me, but I would say that the point of thinking about density and its spatial location is that this is not density everywhere. This is, if people are worried about their neighborhoods becoming too dense, I would say, well, do you live near this major public asset like a transit station? If you don't, you can't have it all. I want access to my transit station, but I don't want anyone else to live there. So there's kind of a real cognitive dissonance going on. But I would say if we can pay attention to these locational context, that argument, and that design of density and how important that is, we might be able to address that in some ways. But it is a problem when you see areas of the city being suburbanized in some way. And I guess actually, if you look at this is a suburbanization of the city, right? I think this is that medical campus right in the west of Chicago. What's up with the parking lots around the transit station there? That's completely wacky. Yeah. Sorry, back there.
Oh, I have like two questions.
Two questions.
First on what you just said, is this UIC?
I think it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then second question, I think maybe a follow-up on the biases. Like I know, well, actually, have you been following like transit policy? And I came late, so sorry if you already went over this, but things like the red line extension, just things that are being talked about at the city level and even at the state level around like Metro, RTA to improve transit infrastructure, and whether anything kind of feels promising, like in pursuit of development beyond TOD, or there are like improvements to TOD that you could imagine. Yeah, things like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, anytime I see housing development going up near transit, especially if it's out of the loop, I say yay. But you got to imagine that there was a lot of fight often to get that there. So one thing city planners can do is work with neighborhoods to make that less of a fight every time. Maybe, why was there a 3% decline in population around transit areas in the last 20 years outside of the loop? Why? What's happening? It's not about institutions. It's the people sitting on land. I know the Green Line stop right down here, that hasn't seen any population increase. And from what I hear, there's people just sitting on their land, just waiting to see what'll happen. Why aren't we incentivizing actual development? And there's a lot the city could be doing. But my role as an ivory tower academic, and you guys too, is to illuminate and, give the fodder for, making arguments about what makes more sense.
Yeah, I guess I have a bit of a cautionary tale. In Sweden, there was a lot of these high density urban areas built with a lot of these principles that you discussed. They were often like buildings with round shapes.
Yeah.
So that there's like a kind of shared space in the middle that allows access to all the basic necessities like a grocery store, pharmacy, and so on. That was built in the 60s or the 70s because it was a rapidly urbanizing country at that point. But if we're looking at exactly these places now, they're really enclaves of poverty and segregation. And I wonder how we can make sure that we develop the right kind of density so that we're not kind of falling into the same trap where we create spaces that provide all of these assets so people don't have to move out of their own little enclave and basically isolate groups.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, the Swedish case. But I guess, there's, as I said, diversity really thrives where no one housing type is more than 60% of the housing type. So in those cases you're mentioning, pretty monolith, pretty homogeneous, right, in terms of building type. So in these lower density areas around Chicago where we've been losing population, we could put in a much more diverse kind of building fabric that isn't the monolithic kind of all high rise, all a single kind of building type or housing unit type. So I guess that's one possible thing. A lot of social housing there too, right?
Well, I mean, there's other processes. A lot of the housing that was desirable was sold off in the 90s into private apartments, homeowner associations, but not in the less desirable parts. So that creates
Kind of awful design.
in the 60s, 70s.
The worst decades.
Thank you so much. There's so much to think about here. One thing that just strikes me about, housing, putting housing, you have the fear of gentrification that I think is also just kind of haunting those efforts to accomplish the goal that is so important here. But one of the things that strikes me is just there's some kind of just there's some almost like inevitable, or maybe it's not inevitable. I'd be interested to compare what happened in Chicago with other cities where you have this built environment of these assets that are so important, that were created in a particular moment for a particular population, distribution of industries, all that stuff. And then, and now everybody's living down, now that density has shifted down into the loop. And so you have these kind of like sunk costs, these assets that are like frozen, they're like relics almost. And how are there other cities that have like you think of New York as different, obviously it's always different, but are there other cities that have managed to
move their assets
yeah,
to where the density is?
to continue yeah, exactly, to sort of,
Yeah, kind of a chicken and egg thing.
yeah.
I don't know about that. I do think that Chicago is not at all one of the worst cities when it comes to this, because I've also looked at 10 other cities. Who Can Walk was the name of the paper, really thinking about these assets and who has access to them. And what's interesting about gentrification, you mentioned that, it's the loss of density that's gentrifying in a lot of places. So that's sometimes density gentrifies, sometimes the loss of it gentrifies. It kind of goes both ways. It becomes pretty complicated.
Also, one comment to that, most of the parks in Chicago were taken over from industrial centers. So like a lot of them used to be factories, and then once they closed, eventually the city took the land from the parks and neighborhoods. So not exactly what you're saying, but repurposing that for more public good.
How do we explain the loop then? Because the loop, the population growth in the loop, because the loop not really have any of those kind of lovable characteristics that you highlighted in the other study, greenery incorporated. Lots of
Density bonuses,
cute front porches and everything.
density bonuses, TIF, policies specifically about increasing density in the loop.
Yeah, but I guess there's still, the study about the lovely streetscapes kind of implies that it's the agency of the person who's house hunting or looking for an apartment that they'll choose a desirable neighborhood. Like a TIF does not make me live anywhere,
Who are those people?
who are the, I guess kind of what I'm asking is seems like there's some other variable that's drawn these people to the loop despite all of its unlovable characteristics. And what is that? And should we be trying to identify that drawing variable And, celebrating at a certain level. To be clear, I don't want to live in the loop, I'm really surprised at the phenomenon that you've identified in these, these books and papers.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand it more.
Yeah, I mean, yes,
Well, in some cases, I'm not sure social interaction is what they're looking for when they move back to the loop. They're looking for access to a different set of assets, cultural and otherwise. So I think the sorts of buses that they're looking for might be different from the street buses.
Well, they're in migrating, right? So the ones that have graduated from college in Iowa, right? And they are now coming to the big city. They often will go to the north side, right? To those lake views, the West Coast villages and things of that nature. But then there's that next tier that are actually in migrating into the city to be close to their work. And they are populating in that loop. And I'm gonna have to take you on a loop tour because it is a lovely place to is the front door. That's your front door, right? There's a reason Brenham said you can't build anything on the other side of this, right? Because that's all of our front yard. That Grant Park, Millennium Park. And so for a lot of them, even if they're not living, east of Dearborn and they're still further west, you can see where you're going. It's like, oh, there's the lake straight ahead, head east, right? So it is a draw for things. I had a question.
yes.
In your surveys, did you take a look at the funding mechanisms for the transportation-oriented design in the non-loop areas? So my brain immediately, when you were showing that map, kind of went to the 95th Street corridor development plan that just passed in council. And it is in relation to that 95th Street extension plan. And so there's a housing component that does have townhomes, but it also has multi-units that are closer to the 95th Street L stop. And then as you venture out, you've got townhouses and so different, what you were looking for, which is the various or the diversity of housing type, as well as ownership model. But I also know that part of the challenge of getting that plan through and then ultimately to get it done is the funding structure, right? So it's much easier to get a light tech credit, right? If you're doing multi-unit, affordable housing, and you can make the numbers balance because you're gonna put 60 units in it, right? As opposed to the stuff that the neighbors love in these neighborhoods, which are the more palatable 2 to 3s. So you're getting the density, but it doesn't seem like it's just this major influx of density at the same time without room or having space to do the additional resources like federal parks and things of that nature. So I'm wondering, was there an opportunity to look at funding and that if that has any implication for vibrancy, the development program?
Yeah, I need to go back and look at that in more detail. Because as I said, overall, it's 3% decline. And the growth was really in the loop. And then that one map I showed did have little specks here and there of some housing development in outlying station areas. And maybe those are the ones you're talking about. Where there was some housing unit growth, and maybe that had to do with financing.
You won't see it yet because the plan is just done.
Oh, it's just the
right. So,
plan.
right.
Okay, so I'll check back.
Actually build. It's not that there's political or community will.
Yeah.
It's the numbers don't shake up because of how we typically fund development. And so if you're not doing a multi-unit with so many units, it's much more difficult to get the finances to work out. So kind of to the gentleman's point about, are we looking or seeing the other funding structures, or to your point about the TIFs driving the development downtown and not as many out in the neighborhoods, what other tools might there be that can help us change direction?
Let's work on that.
It is one, I know you have a stop at 1:30.
I do, yeah.
So,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Emily.
thank you.